And you're live.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Barbara Peters from Scottsdale, where it's 116, and we're talking to Connie Berry, who's in northern Wisconsin, where it's like 68 or something. But still, we're going to be talking about another English mystery, and I think this one has a very pretty cover, which is sort of hard to see, but there we are. So, Connie, the first book, if I remember, it was in Scotland, right? You had to A Dream of Death. So,
That's right.
yep, going back a bit, just for people who've never read
Yeah.
this series, what you've done is you've taken an American and used her as your, character, which is in many ways safer in writing a British mystery if you're not actually British.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think it's a really good thing because there's a bit of that outsider thing, that comes in, and you can do culture clashes. And over the course of these books, you've had people trying to merge very different lives in order to live together, so I think it's a great design. But how did you start it off in A Dream of Death?
You mean how did I decide to set it in Scotland, or how
I
did
mean,
it just start? Well, it started because Kate, my protagonist, Kate Hamilton, she is an American. She is an antique dealer. She had a thriving shop in Jackson Falls, Ohio, not too far from where I live, although it's a fictional city. And she had been married to a Scottish man who was a professor at law professor at Case Western. And he grew up on the Isle of Glenroth, which is a fictional island in the Inner Hebrides. He had a sister who owned a country house hotel there, and he one night said to her, because the sister-in-law was known to get herself in trouble financially in many other ways, and he said, Kate, if anything ever happens to me, you will take care of my sister, won't you? And she thought it was a strange request, but of course she said, well, sure. Well, little did she know that within a very short period of time, he would be gone. He had heart problems. So she is called to Scotland because her sister-in-law is once again in trouble. And because of the promise she made, she goes to try to help her. Well, things soon go south. There is a dead body. Actually, it's a sister-in-law who's killed. It's not really much of a spoiler. And a man with cognitive impairment, a very dear man who was her husband's very best friend growing up, is thought to be the main suspect. And because Kate knows his character and knows him, she knows he cannot have done it. The problem is he's confessed.
right.
So she has to figure this all out. And while she is there, it is well past the time for, people to come to visit that island. It is into November. And there's only one other person staying at this country house hotel, and it happens to be a detective inspector in the Suffolk Constabulary. And so he isn't really part of the investigation, but he knows the Scottish man who is brought in from the Scottish, I think it's called the
It's
Important
Police
Crimes Unit or
Scotland.
something.
No, today it's called Police
Police
Scotland.
Scotland. Yeah. So they kind of parachute people in to take care of important crimes like murder. So he's kind of involved, and they meet, and they're not attracted to each other at first. Well, she isn't. I think he probably is. And then he goes back to Suffolk, and it just turns out in the second book that Kate's daughter is a student at Oxford University at Magdalen College and has an internship between terms at a stately home in Suffolk. And she invites her to come for a couple of weeks over the Christmas holidays. And of course, Kate and Tom then meet up. And so as it turns out, Kate actually moves there permanently. She's now working with an antiquities dealer in this little town, fictional town of Longbarston. And there is a romance, and there are all kinds of things going wrong that involve fine antiques. And Kate's expertise leads her into investigating.
Right. So that's the legacy of murder. And then gradually over the art of betrayal and the shadow of memory. Kate keeps returning or staying in Long Barstow, and she and Tom eventually decide they're going to spend their lives together. There's a wonderful character that is in Finchley, a Lady Barbara, and I'm really fond of her. She's an elderly woman who is trying to keep together, the property and so forth. So anyway, we've had a chance to really explore Long Barstow and the antiques. There's usually an antique that's kind of at the heart of this, at least, which is great. And Kate figures out what to do with her business back in Ohio, her antiques business, and how to. But in this book, Finally a Collection of Lies, they have finally gotten married and they're going on a honeymoon. So we get to go away from Suffolk. We get to go to Devon. Yay.
Yes.
So you were looking forward to writing this. I mean, I think it's great that you took your time to get them together over the course of the books.
Yeah, they had a lot of twists and turns. Actually, the actual wedding takes place in the novella that I wrote between books 4 and 5. It's book 4.5. It's called Mistletoe and Murder. So they do actually make it to the church, but it's a very close run thing. But now they are married and they have to decide where to go on a honeymoon. And they could go anywhere in the world, actually, but they choose Devon, and it's in January. So it's certainly not the ideal time to go, although the winters are much, much milder in the UK. But Kate is hoping that Tom is going to accept a position as a private investigator with a firm based in Toronto. It's a man that he knew from his early days in the Suffolk Constabulary, who's established this kind of international private investigations firm. And he's been trying to talk Tom into taking early retirement, which Kate loves because she believes it's going to be much less dangerous for him. And so they are on their honeymoon, but it's kind of a working honeymoon because at the same time they are investigating a Victorian dress owned by, they think, a Victorian lace maker. It's covered in blood. The woman was thought to be a murderer, but no body was ever found. No person was ever missing. No animal carcass was ever found either. And she would never talk about it. She spent the rest of her life absolutely silent, giving no clue as to why she came home on a Sunday night with blood all over her dress. And this dress is going to be the centerpiece of a local history museum. They are starting a new display called Famous Crimes in Devon's History. And if this dress is really hers, this is going to be the centerpiece. And so that's their job, is to find it just a nice historical murder, find out, did the dress really belong to her? If so, is the blood human? Is it, can they still do any DNA testing, that sort of thing? Well, of course, those plans don't go well either, because right at the beginning of their time in the museum, there is a fundraising gala at which a shot rings out, and that starts a whole series of events that lead to a murder to be
investigated. Right, sure. So are you actually, I know this will be a little bit of a spoiler, but are you actually thinking about moving Tom out of the police?
Well, that would be a spoiler because that's the big question until the very end of the book.
Okay.
So people read the end of the book, and there are a couple of surprises in regard to that. So, but that is definitely, it's not necessarily a done deal, but.
Well, I can see that it's something to think about. Personally, I've always really liked police procedurals. So I'm never entirely sure that the private eye concept works in the UK like it does in the US. But for a lot of reasons, policing in the UK is so different than it is here.
Yes.
Yes,
it's very different. And actually, I love police procedurals. But one of the reasons why I didn't do it, there's a little bit of police procedure involved because Tom is a detective inspector. Now he's the DCI. But really, Kate is not, she's not in the police. She can't tell people with a badge, I want to ask you questions. She can't arrest anybody. She can't charge anybody. So her investigating has to do with the objects in the antiques, but strangely enough, they intersect.
Right. Well, I mean, and that's really plausible, but I know you probably don't remember all this, but back in the 1990s, there was a huge, you know, how publishing falls in love with something and then, they publish everything. Right now it's romantasy, and once upon a time it was Twilight, and then Da Vinci clones and all. There was a whole thing called the women's sleuth movement in the 90s, and it was generated really by Sue Grafton and Marcia Muller and Sarah Paretsky and all, but it was an attempt to break.
And Barbara Peters.
Sorry?
I mean, not Barbara Peters, the archaeologist woman. What it was.
Yeah,
Elizabeth Peters, yes.
Which was actually not her real name, but one of her many pseudonyms. But anyway, the idea was that the male PI was a staple of crime fiction, whether it was in Chandler or Hammett or whatever. And this was a successful effort by women writers to put women into that role. But the problem is the problem you just mentioned. The problem is that private eyes do not have power of arrest. They don't get to do the things that policemen do. So it became just kind of a cliche that every one of them had to wind up with some relationship with somebody in law enforcement. But that was true. If you really go back and think about it, Lord Peter Wimsey had his brother-in-law, and Mr. Campion had, I can't remember the name of the cop that he used to work with. And Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot had Inspector Japp, I think it was, and Miss Marple.
Eventually, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So, that's always been the issue with an amateur sleuth, so to speak, and not law enforcement sleuth, is that at the end of the day, they have to be in some kind of relationship with somebody in law enforcement, because otherwise, they can't resolve the whole thing.
Well, Kate really isn't investigating the crimes as much as she is investigating the mystery surrounding the objects in which she has expertise. Absolutely. And one of the things I didn't want to do, which you do see sometimes, to me it's a cliche, is the woman has to step in because the police are so inept.
Right.
And so the police are going way off in the wrong direction. And so, this smart woman has to come in. Now, that's not to say that smart women don't come in and solve problems for men every once in a while, but that isn't something that I was interested in doing. So I have a lot of respect for the UK police. And one of the privileges that I had was to meet a woman DCI in the Suffolk Constabulary, the Western Division, exactly where Tom is. And she was good enough to meet with me and to show me all around their police department and introduce me to their forensics people and show me their holding facility and answer questions that I had. And she was absolutely delightful. She was a kind of a young woman with a family, but she was a detective inspector, and that was her job. And it was the same job that Tom has. So that was a nice benefit.
Absolutely. Well, no matter what you write, there are things you have to overcome. If it's all police procedural, then you wind up with conflicts in the cop shop or, other things that happen. If you do a private investigator, you have to overcome the lack of law enforcement capabilities. I think you've done a really nice job with this, so far, and that it's interesting to have Kate, looking into, what is it, the Chinese antique, or, the various things that have come along, while Tom is doing Tom's thing, but also, can cross over. So I think they make a really interesting pair. And, in a long series, I'm not saying it's not okay to, change things up. Because, sometimes it feels like you need to do that in order to bring fresh energy into it. It all depends on you, the writer.
Yeah. Well, it's been a lot of fun, and because of Kate's expertise and because of her collaboration with the antiquities expert Ivor Tweedy, um, the benefit they have is they actually are consultants. They have been consultants for police departments in several
Right.
occasions where the police know policing, but they don't know anything about the world of antiques and antiquities and history. So she has a skill that she brings to the table
Mhm.
that the police have come to respect. Tom certainly respects it, but even the
Right.
police that she's working with do.
Well, I'm a very fond of Jane Collin, or was very fond, because she's not currently writing them, but she wrote a
Oh, yes,
wonderful series with Josie Prescott, and I learned so
yes,
much from her about antique, but she also had set it in New England, so smaller, more like
yeah,
England. It would be harder to
yeah,
have written it if she had it like in New Mexico or some much larger state. And I
yeah.
really
No,
miss
I love that series.
me too. And so I really, because I already enjoy Jane, I've always been interested in art and antiques mystery because it's fun to learn stuff. I have a Daniel Silva on Saturday, and this is a Daniel
Ah,
Silva that is actually a British, it's a murder mystery. Gabriel has retired from spying. It's a murder in Cornwall, and it's, an art, various things to do with art, another murder in Paris. And
what what is the name of it?
it's called The Death in Cornwall.
Death in Cornwall. Okay,
Mhm. But
on my list.
yeah, I loved his spy novels, but I think realistically that Gabriel aged out of being able to do, although in this book he does a ton, but credibly speaking, he was getting a bit old for the field work and so forth.
Yeah,
Um, and also, I think Daniel really enjoyed the art restoration and the arts stuff as much as the politics. So currently, that's where we are. Anyway, there was a man named Ian Paris who wrote a really great
oh
series. Do
yeah,
you remember those art mysteries that
yes,
involve the
yes,
art squad in Rome, if I recall?
yes, yeah,
So I think mystery readers are always interested in learning things and tend to gravitate often towards books, libraries, antiques, art, other
yeah.
sort of cultural or creative kinds of things, rather than just, um, corporate espionage or, other kinds of murder. It's interesting how readers divide. Some people
Yeah,
always want to read the same thing, and other people want to read all over, in the
yeah,
spectrum.
yeah.
Yeah. And right
Well,
now,
I was just going to say that's the world that I grew up in. My parents were high-end antique dealers, and so I have that familiarity with that world, and it's a very interesting world. And I've said this before, but that the antique dealers tend to be very gossipy with each other, and they're always talking about who bought what they paid for it, what they should have paid for it, who got fooled, who unethically fools, so there's just a lot of things that I just kind of, absorbed growing up. And
sure,
so I love that. But actually, my real love is just history and how history affects people today. And antiques are a little bit of a metaphor or a vehicle for that, because
sure,
they objects are kind of time travelers. They were created and they were used originally in a certain time period, but they have survived when the people that had them have not. They have survived, and many of them have stories. And my mom was wonderful at researching and drawing out those stories, and she would present them to people. And and I've said this again too a couple times, but her quote was, well, that way you're not, so people aren't just buying an object, they're buying a piece of history.
Which I think
So
is very
that's,
true. And in point of fact, in the high-end antiques trade, provenance is a really important thing. You know,
it
the
is.
chain of ownership. That's one of the questions in the Silva is that is the painting, was the painting looted? And the Louvre has decided it is and wants to return it to its original owner where, you know,
Yeah.
obstacles come up. And I was talking earlier today to Donna Leon, who has written about art and so forth in her Venetian Mystery.
Yes.
And you know, those
Wonderful books.
they are wonderful books. I really feel lucky that she's been my friend and so forth for so many years. But again, those questions, certainly in a place like Venice, come up all the time. You know, what are the stories behind the art? Who are the creatives? Who's the actual owner of these things? How do we preserve them? And I think it's a very fertile ground for probing the past for history. And, you know, in many
Mhm.
ways, it's kind of like writing cold cases. You know, if you have to start wherever the painting is or the whatever, the antique, the Chinese jar, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And in creating its provenance, it's really like working a cold case. If you were like, you know, Harry Bosch in the LAPD trying to work out the roots of a crime. I think it's great. So let's talk about Devon and let's talk about the Romany because that is the travelers, the Romany, whatever you want to call them.
Mhm.
They don't show up in crime fiction as often as I think they might.
I have a man that I met. He started out to be a sensitivity reader, but he has since become a friend. He is an OBE. He is a doctor. He is I think he might be in his 80s now. He's retired, but he is one of the most prominent, well-known Romani leaders,
Hmm.
especially in the West Country. His name is Dr. Thomas Acton. And I was very fortunate to get him. I wanted him, I asked him just to read the sections that I had that involved the Romani people. Actually, they're called Romanishals in
Right.
England. They're kind of a separate ethnic group. But he ended up reading the entire book and he was just absolutely delightful, invaluable, and just opened my mind to that culture. In fact, he just emailed me a couple of days ago and he said he was going to present my book. He's going to read a paper at a meeting and he's going to bring my book. And he said, the people there are so interested to read about the Romanis in popular culture, how they're presented in popular culture. And he said, I fear they will be disappointed in your book because it is fairly accurate and insightful. So they love to see how the Romani people are mispresented
Right.
and caricatures are presented. And I was fascinated with that because in Devon, they have all the ponies that are out on Dartmoor Park, National Park.
Right.
And once a year in the autumn, they have a thing called the drift, where they round them all up and they bring them in, and they're all owned by somebody, and they just check to make sure that they're in good health. And some of them have had colts, and some of them are sold, and all of that. And in the past, it was the Romany men who were very good with horses who would come and help with the drift, and then they would go on their way, doing other things. They were kind of like a mobile workforce in the UK, very, very useful, but they definitely have their own culture. And one of the huge surprises to me was the fact that they are not offended by the word gypsy.
Really?
In fact, they like that word. That is not true of the Roma people. They're different. They're people who came 11th to the 13th century out of India, and they came through mostly Russia, Eastern Europe, and those are people that have emigrated mostly to the United States. The Romanishal people came also 11th to 13th centuries, but they came through France and then went to the UK where they many of them intermarried with the Irish travelers, and they say we are proud to own that name because our ancestors died for it. And so
Wow.
that was just a complete change of mind for me. And my editor was a little nervous about that. And she said, you have to make it clear that Kate herself is uneasy about that term in the beginning, which I did because I was uneasy about it. You don't want to offend anyone.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm actually not in favor of sensitivity reading, but I've had cases presented, that I think that we're in an age where people are so quick to take offense, and social media allows that to snowball, that it has really scared a lot of people. If you go back and
Well,
read Chandler in
yes.
the original, that would never be able to be published today.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that social media is good for, but there are an awful lot of things that I think have really harmed culture and the way that we interact with people and the way we look at things. Donna and I were talking about that in the sense of a rise of a lot of violence among teenagers. And one reason that they have formed these kind of gangs in her book, and we have one here in Scottsdale called the Gilbert Goons, you might have read about, is that social media allows these kids to connect in a way that when we were young, certainly when I was young, we had telephones, but we didn't have any ways, to go out and communicate, secret meeting places and all this kind of stuff that kids can get up to, and has led to a lot of violence in Italy. And here in Phoenix, it actually led to the beating to death of a teenager, and the consequences of it haven't been fully explored. So I think as a crime writer, if you're writing in the present, you have to keep up with, not just technology, but the effects of technology on how people behave and how crimes are investigated. It's really complicated. But anyway, I thought that you wrote really well about, I've been to Devon, I've been to Dartmoor, and I've actually hiked along the coast in Devon, which is a
Oh,
beautiful,
have you?
yeah,
Yeah, it's a wonderful
beautiful
coastal path.
very much so.
Beautiful.
I haven't actually met any Romany, but one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about was the lace maker, because I've
Oh,
always been fascinated with lace making, and I've been to a number of museums in Europe, possibly Ireland, I can't remember. Anyway, lace making is an old art, and there's some extraordinary, beautiful, creations that are made not by machine, although that's how it's mostly made today, but back when people actually,
yeah,
took a pillow and created a pattern and did all that rest of it. So
yeah,
how much of lace
yeah.
making did you decide to go into?
Well, I visited the All Hallows Lace Museum.
Hmm,
Actually, it's more than a lace museum, but it's in Honiton, Devon, and um, I just was fascinated. I hadn't planned actually on that, but I was so fascinated by not just the lace and the incredible beauty and the mind-boggling skill and time that it took to produce just an inch of lace.
that's right.
But I was fascinated by the lives of the lace makers. And at least in Devon, I know there's many, many styles of lace, and every, country and every part of a country has different styles. And Honiton lace, which is in Devon, is woven on pins stuck into this bolster with all of these bobbins, and they just wind, and they produce little tiny motifs, mostly from nature, some kind of scroll work. And then they take these little motifs and join them together with plates and bars and make an overall pattern. But little young girls would be sent to lace schools because it was a way of making a living, and they were sent very, very young. and they had they could, work outside during the summertime, but in the winter when it was cold, they had to be indoors, but there was no light. There was no electric light. So, but they couldn't have a fire because that was thought that it was going to discolor the lace. So they, were freezing, and they had like little coal things at their feet, and and they had little what they called flashes that were like silvery things that would reflect the light onto the lace. But I mean, it was so incredible that today no one does it. I mean, there are a few people who do it like a hobby to demonstrate, but no one can produce this. Nobody would have the patience or the time. And if they did, no one would be able to afford to buy this. And some of the lace it just is mind blowing. And I learned, and I was fascinated by the fact that Queen Victoria wanted to help the lace makers of Devon because most of the lace had to be sent over to the continent. Nobody could afford to buy it except in London or some of the big cities. But she had lace, like a lace overlay and veil made for her wedding dress out of Honiton lace. And they just had beautiful examples there. And then all of the stories of these women. There were a few men who were lace makers as well, but most of them were women.
Right.
And their lives were hard, very, very hard. And, today we just look back, and I mean, I do, and I'm just amazed. So I just thought that was such a fascinating thing, kind of like the Romany culture. So I get excited about things when I travel, and then I want to weave them into the story
Sure.
because I just want to find out more about it.
Yeah, no, I can easily understand that. I mean, people, there are, I think, two aspects to all of that. One is that oftentimes people really could only afford one dress or two, but what they could do was change the lace, the ornaments, so that it would look different. Lily Langtry, I think there was a TV series about her. She was so poor that her solution to the dress issue was she had, I think it was like one black dress, but she was able to make it look different all the time, you could do cuffs, you could do tippets, you could do aprons, you could do all kinds of things. And then the other end of it was, people who were really fashionable and could afford all kinds of fancy clothes. And lace was a big part of that. And the lace, I mean, it would depend a lot on what kind of thread. Were you using cotton? Were you using silk? Were you using, color? What was the width? How was it? Was the thread kind of rough or was it super fine? But I was always fascinated with this, looking at this pillow, and people would use the pins to pick out these designs and then weave them.
Yeah.
And I think weaving is fascinating. We were in Western Ireland, and I think it was 2019, right before everything shut down. And there was a carpet factory there, and I can't remember now what the actual carpet is, but it was a particular way of weaving carpets that was brought from Scotland to the west coast of Ireland. And there are only like 3 women now in the village that know how to use the looms and how to make this. But there's one in Buckingham Palace. There's one, I can't remember. They're not, like India, they're not super elegant. But what was just sort of broke my heart. We were there on a cruise, very small ship cruise. Took us forever to even find this little museum where the carpet people were. But what broke my heart was that these 3 women didn't have anyone who really wanted to learn from them before it was too late how these rugs were made. And so they were basically keeping going something that they knew was about, there was no demand for it. There was nobody who wanted to do it. And, in industrial age takes away a lot of those kinds of I once sat on the city walls I'm trying to remember where it was in Wales. There's a castle, so I'll call it Conwy because I can't remember.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
But anyway, I investigated the castle, and then I wandered outside and sat down on the wall in the sun. And next to me was a man eating what the British call a packed lunch. so he had we would have called it a lunchbox or, a bag lunch, anyways, pack lunch. And so we got to talking, and it turned out he was the city mason. And his job was, in fact, to look after, the fabric of the walls that we were sitting on in the castle and all. But what was worrying him was that he couldn't find any apprentice. He worried about what would happen. He was probably maybe 50, maybe a little bit younger, can't remember exactly. But he was really worried about the fact that he needed to teach this skill set to somebody, but nobody really seemed to want to do it. And so what was going to happen? But then I think recently there's been a sort of return of people looking to learn some of the older crafts. I mean, if you go to
I hope so.
well, I think Williamsburg has done a great job. I've been there several times and I get their magazine, and it's really fascinating to me how, they've not only brought back a lot of old skills, but they have regular apprentice programs that are financed,
That's
and
excellent.
teach people how to do stuff. And I'm hoping that the British are doing the same, because who is in fact going to look after the castle walls or whatever?
True. And in England, of course, they have all of these old historic buildings, and people need to know how to repair them and how to take care of them. Actually, I have a nephew in Norway, and I don't know what happened to this girl, but he had a girlfriend one time who was a gilder. That was her job. All she did was gild, where things had been gilded and the gold had worn off, and she would re-gild things. And she worked for, I think, the palace in Oslo. And there's a lot of gilding. So she, had a lot of work for herself. But it's the same thing with thatchers and, people who restore paintings. And there's just so much, not so much in our country, although we do have it, Williamsburg and some of the older settlements, but in Europe, the depth of their history that is still there it just boggles the mind, and it's so expensive.
Yep, it's also true in Asia. I mean, when in traveling in Asia, there be all kinds of markets, or if you go to historic sites, there are all kinds of, like little setup markets outside where people are still making stuff. They're trying to sell it to tourists, but they're also making it for their own consumption. And they have a history that's as old or older than Europe, that, stone carving and all kinds of things but they seem to have a better population, a larger population, maybe people more willing to work for very little and difficult conditions, I think as people aspire to a bigger lifestyle, a more relaxed, comfortable, elegant, whatever you want to call it, they're less inclined to want to do labor unless it's a hobby. So, I don't know, a lot of things will be lost, but there are also new things that are coming along. So, I'm pleased that in this
Technology.
I'm pleased that in this burst of romantasy, which is taking over currently publishing, if you've seen any of them, the books are really beautiful, and they brought back 4-edge painting. In other words, this part of the book now becomes a work of art, and you open the book.
Oh, yes.
The papers are gorgeous, and there's gilding, but instead of doing it by hand, they have the technology of printing has advanced to the point where these books can be produced, and I'm telling you, they are absolutely gorgeous, and sell for essentially the same price as if it didn't have all that.
Wow, I'm gonna have to look for that.
Oh, you should. I mean, we just filled an entire bookcase at the store with these books, and to do them justice, you have to shelve them face out, i.e. cover out, and then 4-edge painting this out, and then the spine that way. And if you could, but there isn't really room, you would open it, because the end papers, this part of the book, when you open it, are absolutely gorgeous as well. And then in a lot of them, if you take the cover off, the actual casing of the book, this part without the jacket, will have some kind of design on it. And none of that would really be affordable. You've probably seen lots of medieval books and, even later that were produced as
Well,
works
yeah.
of art. They have jeweled covers and, you could go to the cloisters at the Met and you can see, carved ivory, covers for books and all kinds of stuff. They're able to do it thanks to technology without the expense. And I'm going to be really interested to see if what happens is that people will start buying books not just for the story, but also for the packaging, and
For the beauty
ideally
of it. Yeah.
you'd have a beautiful book, but you'd also have a good story. I'm hoping it won't be one
How
of
much
those
do they
things.
sell for?
$32, same almost price. Your book is
Oh,
31. Yep.
yeah.
It's
Which is
astonishing.
high.
Now, it really is.
Yeah.
What I'm hoping
Oh,
is that what
my parents
happened,
collected those books.
yeah. I
I'm
don't,
sorry, my parents collected those books
oh, did they?
that you're talking about with the illuminated page edges and all of that. So I remember being fascinated by those.
Well, they really are.
Interesting.
As I said, what I'm hoping won't happen is that they will become a cover up for really bad stories. Um, because that would be a temptation maybe. But so far, the ones that we have, I think have been the stories have been good. So it's fascinating to see it. And now there's a new sort of subset of it called the cozy fantasy, which is basically you know, like a cozy mystery, but instead of it being in the chocolate shop on the shores of Lake Michigan, it's going to be in some, mystical island somewhere or something. And I don't know how much of this is people just trying to escape where we are, but when you were a child, I don't know what you read, but I read the Oz books for years and I loved them. And I love Narnia, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, all those books. And that really is kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't write fantasy, but I don't read fantasy. Although I did just read a partial manuscript like that. It's a cozy fantasy and yeah, it's unpublished. I was just reading it to give a little bit of feedback and it was actually fascinating. I was very interested in it and in the world they
We're
created.
doing
But
an event
yeah,
tomorrow night for two of them, and I think the spell shop is one, and you
mm,
can't spell treason without T is the other. And they have the illuminated edges and other stuff, and interesting stories. So it'll be fun to see. Before we call Jacob up, do you have another book in this series in the works?
I am working on two books right now. I'm working on book 6 in the Kate series. Will that go forward? I don't know yet. I'm also working on a new standalone historical,
Ooh.
and I'm trying to get both of them up to a certain point where I can send them off to my agent, and she can, you know,
Mhm.
see which one, the one that comes in first is the one I'll continue working on. But
Sure.
yeah, I'm loving the book 6 in the Kate series, and I hope very much that it's published.
Well, I do too. I wish that your publisher were more inclined to do paperbacks for their hardcovers, because they don't always, and it's a big investment for people, especially at this price point.
Yeah, and this was a bump up. They did bring out the first two books in trade paperback, and they're just all being published by Thorndike in large print. And I just got the cover for A Dream of Death, the first one from Thorndike, and it is amazing. It is so gorgeous. I'm so thrilled about it. I'm waiting to see if they'll let me show people. But the books are also coming out in trade paperback.
Well,
So
I
I think
hope
they've got
so.
the
I mean,
first
I
two.
think, yep, I think that there would be a very strong market for your
No, I
books.
mean mass market paperback. I'm sorry, I misspoke. So
The
all of
smaller
them are
ones.
coming out in mass market paperback too.
That's interesting. I haven't seen them do that before. Is that something new?
It's with World, is it Harlequin Worldwide Library?
Yeah. But it
Yeah.
is, but they do not make those books available to the book trade. Those are a subscription.
Oh, oh, I didn't know that. Well, I learned something tonight.
No,
I just all of a sudden I got a box in the mail and
sure. I wish they did, but that is a subscription club. It's quite large, and they buy the
oh,
rights and they print them for the members of those clubs. But they are
ah,
not, at least over the last 25 years or so, they have not been available for bookstores to buy and sell in bookstores.
okay.
So I think it's great though, because that gives you a readership, that can read them in paperback. So Jacob, come and join us and see if we have any questions that anyone would like to ask of our author, Connie. I have to wait for him to appear. There he is. Magic.
Hey there. Yeah, lots of comments. No questions yet. If you wanted to continue the conversation,
Yeah.
wait till the questions come in.
All right. Well, one of the usual questions, Connie, is what is it that you yourself like to read? We've touched on it slightly, but do you have any recommendations?
I actually like to read police procedurals. Almost all the books I read, this is not necessarily a good thing, but it's true. Almost all the books that I read are British. That's just what I enjoy reading. I love reading the classics. I'm just rereading all of the Jane Austen books. I'm starting with Sense and Sensibility. So I love reading all the classics, but I love British crime fiction. I love police procedurals. I've really started loving suspense, like the Ruth Ware and I can't think of the other one's name, the other author's name that I like so well. But I love all kinds of crime fiction, but I almost read, besides the classics, I read British crime fiction, and I should branch out. And sometimes I do because I'm in a book club and I get pushed into reading something and then I think, oh, that's wonderful. Why haven't I read that before?
Well, there's
So
only so much time.
yeah.
I really enjoy it myself, and we have been expanding our paperback inventory through importing quite a few British paper. Jacob gets stuck trying to figure out what to charge for them, but there's some wonderful British police procedural or amateur sleuth, whatever it is, set in various parts that don't appear here in the US at all. So I like to think that people can come to the Poison Pen and not find just, the same stuff you can find everywhere, but can find things that you wouldn't run into normally. And so we try to do a mix of both, the things we should have, and then the things that are unexpected, I think would be the best way to describe it. So that's been really good. You did see, Jacob, by the way, that I did nail down the fact that there is a shipping charge. Sorry,
Oh, is there really?
Yep, there is. That's why I said to you,
Yeah.
you need to add $1 a book to, to cover it, but it's quite reasonable. So
Yeah, it's not.
anyway, I think, Connie, there are lots of people who, really love, there's a more elegant language oftentimes in British fiction than they haven't let their, well, some of them have deliberately, but generally their syntax is, more intact.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do love that, but what I also love is the British wit.
Mhm.
It's very different than American humor. It is dry humor. I when I was, I think, I don't know, about 13, I thought I personally had discovered P.G. Wodehouse, that I thought nobody else knew about him, but I had discovered him in my library, and I read him, and it was funny, but funny in a way that I'd never heard before in my life. And I just love that. And the other thing that I love about the UK is there is more scope there for eccentrics.
That's very
People
well
are
said.
valued. People are valued for their uniqueness, and they're allowed to be unique. And I really enjoy that. It makes creating characters a lot of fun. So I try to always listen when I'm in the UK. One of my very favorite things to do is just to sit in a pub or sit in a sidewalk cafe and just listen to people conversing and just learn how they talk, what they talk about, how they describe their lives, what is important to them. And that is just like feeding that well of experience and you know, I enjoy it. And I think that's why I love to read British crime fiction. I am a complete and utter Anglophile. And that's just where I like to spend my time. It's where I like to write. It's where I like to read. I like to travel there. So that's me.
Why not? You know, I mean, people identify with different, I mean, I know people who feel that way about France or whatever, you know, so
Yes.
it's great that you can indulge it. Jacob, has anything turned up?
Yeah, Robin had a question. She asked, "What does your writing day look like?" Did you want to talk a little bit about your writing process?
Yeah, and I have to be honest and tell you that I am not the most disciplined person in the world. I do better when I have a deadline. It's very hard for me when I don't have a deadline because I get caught up in research, which is what I really love, and I go down rabbit holes. But I do try to write every day. I don't tend to start in the morning. I like to have a slow morning, have my coffee, look at the news, catch up on emails. And then I start to write maybe around 10:30 or 11. And I usually end about 4:30, maybe well, somewhere between 4 and 5. Sometimes at night, I heard Hank Philippi Ryan say this one time that she goes in to say goodnight to her book every night. And I often do the same thing. I go in and just kind of look at what you know, maybe the last paragraph I wrote or something like that. But I am what they call a tentpole writer, if you know what that is. So I don't, you know, I don't really plot out. I plot out major plot points. So I kind of know where the book is going. That gives me confidence, but I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get from point A to point B. So I let that creative process happen kind of organically. So I try to put those two things together. Hopefully that answers the question, Robin's
That's a very
question.
complete answer, actually. Thank you.
That's it.
All righty. Well, thank you very much. Connie, hang on for just a moment after we say goodbye. Jacob, can you take us off Facebook and YouTube? And let me thank all of you for watching it. Again, this is called A Collection of Lives. It's the 5th in the Kate Hamilton series, and I recommend reading them all, preferably in order.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
All right, you guys are off the stream.
Okay. I wanted to say to you, in case you were wondering, I didn't send you books